inflationary spiral, which was very difficult to control.
Since 1945, Labor and conservative governments alike had preserved Clement Attlee's social welfare programs and most of his nationalizations. But by the mid-1970s, a growing faction within the Conservative Party placed the blame squarely on the legacy of Attlee's government.
In their view, what basically happens in post-war Britain is that socialism, disruptive trade unions, and an expensive welfare state lead to a precipitous political and economic decline. What they see is a welfare state which created a dependency culture. It robbed people of initiative. It robbed people of responsibility. It disrupted the market. It made it impossible for the country to get anything really done.
Among the most outspoken of these conservatives was the party's new leader, Margaret Thatcher.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
Mrs. Thatcher just couldn't bear the idea that British decline should be taken for granted. She rejected that with her guts. She thought Britain should be great. Searching around for what was wrong, she decided that what the economy needed was a dynamic shakeout, was to make people self-reliant again, and above all to break the power of the trade union movement.
In the summer of 1978, the Labour Party was in power and gearing up for a new general election.
The Labour government felt that what they really needed was to have a year of very, very low inflation. So they imposed a norm on trade unions, or on all workers, of a 5% increase in wages. In December of that year, the first test of the norm came in a strike or a dispute at Ford Motor Company. And Ford settled for, I believe, about 16%, which was way above a 5% norm. At that moment, the floodgates opened, and all sorts of workers who had pent-up demands for higher wages essentially put those demands to government.
Throughout December 1978 and January 1979, massive strikes shook the country. It would become known as the Winter of Discontent. Most of the striking workers were in the public sector, the nationalized services and industries, truck drivers, teachers, medical workers.
There were stories of ambulance drivers saying things like, yes, we know some people will die if we don't deliver them to the hospital, but we're going to strike anyway. There was a famous strike of grave diggers in Liverpool, which meant that the bodies piled up and were unburied. And there were similar strikes in other public services. Well, this kind of strike really massively erodes public support for strikes, for unions, and for a government that seems completely unable to do anything about it. In December 1978, the Labour government, despite lots of difficulties, still had a lead in the polls over Thatcher and the Conservatives. It was a tiny lead, it was 1 or 2%. By the end of February 1979, less than 3 months later, Thatcher was out in front with a 20% lead.
In Israel, too, socialism was losing some of its appeal. The founders of the kibbutz movement had believed that the communal way of life would embed itself ever more strongly over time. But as the years passed, the trend on the kibbutzim was away from collectivism.
זה התהליך שנמשך למעשה מההתחלה.
If in the beginning we got clothes once a week from the clothing storehouse, then later there were closets, and everyone had their own clothes at home. If at first all the food was in the dining hall, then eventually everyone had an icebox. And then we started to keep things like beverages and fruit inside the house.
After Israeli statehood, the move toward a more private lifestyle accelerated. members began to receive small cash allowances to spend as they wished. The changes extended to families as well. The kibbutz children had lived and slept in a communal children's house. But by the early 1970s, some parents were beginning to have second thoughts.
The communal sleeping sounded very nice, but it was enormously frustrating for parents, particularly for mothers, who really felt they weren't getting enough of their children. They weren't being with them enough, they weren't seeing them enough, they weren't being able to give them enough love.
The children's houses slowly began to empty. Many of the kibbutzim took out loans to pay for adding on children's rooms to their parents' homes. In the midst of such internal change, the kibbutzim suffered a major blow from without. In May 1977, Menachem Begin carried a conservative government into power for the first time in Israel's history. The old Labor government was out, and with it went the subsidies, tax breaks, and contracts it had bestowed on the kibbutzim.
There was a time when we were wanted in Israel. Because we lived in the problematic areas. We produced the food. We were the heroes of this country. Eventually, the state let us know, hinted to us, we don't need you anymore. You are a place of residence like any other. Start being independent.
The kibbutzim were still socialist communities. But practical problems were forcing more and more compromises between the ideal and reality. Tanzania brought far greater disappointments. It was beginning to seem that Julius Nyereri's version of socialism was not as democratic as his supporters had hoped. In 1965, 3 years after he was elected president, he amended the country's constitution to ban all political parties but his own. Nyerere was asked whether a one-party system included safeguards against the abuse of power.
To some extent there are safeguards, but I have sufficient power under the Constitution to be a dictator. This is a dilemma of this movement. Sometimes you build the leader to the extent that at the end, when you think you have become free, the fellow has become so powerful you don't know what to do with him.
Nyerere was looking away from the West for a model of socialism more suited to a poor country like Tanzania. In 1965, he made his first visit to China.
You see, in the year we went to China, Tanzania was in famine. And by that time we were only 15 million people. We went to China with 1 billion and everybody had a full stomach. 1 billion, think of it. They were making their own rails, and they were engineers, building their own houses, building their own roads, you see. And here we couldn't even make a bridge.